So what can be done to change the U.S. correctional system? Joining me now from Chicago is John Maki. He's the executive director of the John Howard Association of Illinois. It's the oldest prison reform organization in the state. We want to welcome you to the heat. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me get right at the heart of things. When you hear this number, it's staggering. 2.3 million, more than 2.3 million. And when you frame that, that's almost the population of Houston, Texas, or Havana, Cuba. It's immense. Why?
Well, I think to start with, it's really important to understand that the United States didn't always have such a high prison population. And in fact, for most of the 20th century, the United States incarcerated less than 250,000 people. And how we got from 250,000 to more than 2.3 million today is really, there are a lot of theories about why that happened, but I think it's the best way to understand it. It's the unintended consequences of bad policy and bad politics.
Well, that's interesting because in the past 2 decades, the imprisonment rate per capita surged by 45%. So walk us through this. What do you think, you're saying bad policy, bad politics, but specifically, and I know you've been there in the trenches, what do you point to? So
I think, to start with, it's important to see that, again, beginning really in the 1970s, we had, again, a population in the United States of about 250,000 people in prison. And in fact, there was a lot of debate that we didn't really need prisons, that prisons weren't really serving a purpose. And so states were finding ways to actually lose prisons. About that same time, the baby boomers came of age, a huge generation of young people. And what we know, what research says, is that people tend to commit crimes between the ages, often men, young men, between the ages of the late teens to the early 30s. So this whole generation was coming of age at a time when there was a debate, when there was movement to actually do away with prisons, or at least to change them. That created an opportunity politically to exploit that. We saw crime rise, and it became a political win to advocate, to argue, to pass laws that lengthened sentences, that made more use of prisons. And then, again, at the same time, we saw the deinstitutionalization of mental health. Before the 1970s in the United States, we had many more mental health hospitals. And we started doing away with those. And so we found more mentally ill people on the streets as opposed to in hospitals. And without the hospitals, we found them in jails and prisons. And it's really, again, the confluence of those factors, which I think led to and leads to the situation we are in today, with more people imprisoned in the United States than any other country in the world.
What about the revolving door aspect? Because we see so many people leave prison and then return.
And that's really the most, I think, tragic part of prison. If prison was an effective response, it would be kind of a one and done thing. You would go to prison and you wouldn't come back. But I think prison's part of our culture, and in many parts of the United States, in many neighborhoods, it's almost a rite of passage. One thing that happens when you go to prison is you have a criminal record that will follow you for the rest of your life. It'll prevent job opportunities, housing opportunities, loan opportunities, and it brands you essentially as a criminal, as a convict. And so because of that, you see people lose hope, and you see that revolving door. And that's literally what it is. I mean, let me give you a concrete example. In my state of Illinois, we have about 50,000 people in our adult prison system. Every year, we release about 35,000 people. And so this revolving door isn't just simply it's not just a figure of speech. It's almost literally true. You're seeing people come in, come out, come in and come out. Most people are serving very short sentences, and it becomes a way of life.
Talk to me about reintegrating these ex-convicts into society. What are some steps that could be taken that aren't being taken that could actually lead to that?
Well, I think, one of the most important things of any form of punishment is that it should enable someone to come back. It should enable someone to reintegrate. In the United States, all across our country, we brand people. If people have a criminal record, that will follow them on job applications, on housing loans, small business loans, school applications, and it makes it very difficult to become a free, productive citizen again. That's a big part of why we have such a huge system, a huge dysfunctional system. So I think laws that would take aim at that would enable someone to come back from prison, to lose the stigma of a conviction. That would do a lot.
What about politicians? They play to the audience, if you will, voters, with this kind of I'm going to get tough on crime, and we've seen this with the 3 strikes laws. And on paper, it looks like a great idea, but in execution, it's been tragic for a lot of people, hasn't it?
Absolutely, and I think the 3 strikes laws, that kind of trend is really symptomatic of how we do justice in the United States. We tend to equate prison with punishment or punishment with prison. And that's just not, that's silly, that's dumb. Prison is only one form of punishment. In terms of effectiveness, it's one of the worst things we can do. In terms of cost, it's extremely expensive. And I think with 3 strikes, we just think if prison equals punishment is good for someone who's done bad things, therefore more prison. And all we've done is bloated our prison system and created a situation where people aren't able to come back to society. Let
me ask you about the war on drugs, because one of the first murder trials I ever covered was small town. It occupied everyone's attention. This guy had a great defense attorney representing him. He created reasonable doubt. And so the jury goes out to deliberate, and during that period of time, they have to get all these cases off the docket. They bring a bunch of young kids in on small charges of possession of marijuana. They all got sent off to prison 4 or 5 years. It was ridiculous. And then the jury comes back and says, well, the guy who has a great attorney, he gets off. We see a lot of this too. Isn't there a disparity? And this war on drugs, a lot of people are going to jail for possession of quantities of marijuana that sometimes are very small.
Absolutely, and we know that these laws are enforced disproportionately. We know, for example, if you're a white youth in an affluent area, you're less likely to be charged and convicted with a crime as, say, if you are a poor youth of color in one of our cities in the United States. I think what's really unusual about the case you covered is that it actually went to trial. Most criminal cases don't go to trial. They're the result of plea deals that are worked out very early in the process. And so I think what this points to is a system that there's very little discretion. Judges really aren't involved in making decisions about sentencing, about making decisions based on mitigating factors, a person's background. And because of that, again, that goes back to the revolving door. People are sent to prison almost on a streamline.
I want to talk to you about these private for-profit prisons as well. In a neighboring state of yours, Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court there in October of 2009 threw out 4,000 convictions of juveniles. And there was a judge who was charged with, and you may have already heard about this case, it was a Cash for Kids scheme, private prison, where he was funneling these kids, a lot of times minor convictions, minor offenses. But these prisons are like hotels. I mean, the occupancy rate's got to stay high. Doesn't that create a bad environment as well?
It's a perverse incentive. Justice should not be involved with profit. I think even the appearance, the semblance of a profit motive, contaminates the justice system. And no doubt, all across the country, we have privatized prisons. Even prisons that aren't privatized, like the ones in my state, we've privatized functions inside the prison. And again, I think it creates horrible incentives, and it makes it much more difficult to tackle the problem of prison reform, which is really about creating a criminal justice system that effectively deals with crime.
You want to change things, and yet there's an organization, the Corrections Corporation of America. They spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 million each year lobbying for more expansive crime laws for this very reason. How difficult is it for you to make any kind of headway when you're up against that kind of opposition?
It's extremely difficult. I don't think it's simply the lobbying powers of corporations that profit from prisons. I think, again, in the United States, we equate punishment with prison. And when we're afraid, when we feel afraid of crime, when we fear for our safety, we want laws that feel like that make us feel safe. Not make us safe, but feel safe. And that's where prison comes in. Prison is held out as a panacea to being afraid. And it's an emotional reaction, but it's one that is very, very strong and overcomes even reasonable argument. If it was just simply a matter of presenting a case to say, look, here's our prison system, here's how much it costs us, here's how it works, I think it'd be easy to arrive at a consensus that we need something different. But as long as we have an emotional response to crime, or as long as emotions drive our response to crime, and as long as that's going to be supported by lobbying powers, it's very, very hard to change.
John Maki, thanks so much for joining us. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.